Joe Heschmeyer, welcome to Catholic Answers Focus, kind of a very special episode of Catholic Answers Focus.
Yeah, thank you for having me on.
And a special episode because we're responding to a video posted by Patrick Coffin, longtime host of Catholic Answers, and really an extraordinary figure in Catholic media, someone who I personally owe a great debt to. I followed him in that chair, but only after having learned from him for a long time, and he really opened up new possibilities, I think, about how to present Catholic media. So very grateful to Patrick. But he posted a piece of video, a little bit of video, and looking at it, we thought, well, we have this association with Patrick, and this is the kind of video that we actually usually respond to. So we thought,
even if it wasn't a former Catholic Answers,
right? If it wasn't
employee,
Patrick, right? And so we thought we better respond to it, and it's called 7 Pieces of Evidence that Francis is an anti-pope. You've seen the video.
I have seen the video.
Well, let me just start off a general sense of that you took away from it, or
Sadness. I mean, it's a really conspiratorial video, and I think we'll get into maybe more of the details of why I'm going to say this.
Right.
But I think it misunderstands the way that God leads his church to imagine that there's these little breadcrumbs you just have to piece together just so, and that's going to reveal that the guy everyone thinks is the Pope isn't really the Pope.
Okay.
That never in the history of God's revelation, Old Testament, New Testament, 2,000 years of church history, has that been the way Israel or the church was run. That one person was thought by everyone to be the person God had chosen, but he'd secretly left these little breadcrumbs. And if you pieced him together just so. Now, certainly he usurps the world power. You got Herod and Jesus and all of that. But I'm not talking about that. We don't have everyone thought Peter was the apostle, but really he'd secretly chosen someone else and they were just pretending it was Peter. That kind of thing isn't of God. That's not how he operates.
It does produce a lot of it. I find myself becoming anxious. It does produce anxiety. But Patrick invited dialogue about this. Mm-hmm. He said, listen with an open mind. I hope we did listen with an open mind because, sometimes you see stuff on the internet and you don't, and you engage it just on an emotional level. But this is Patrick Coffin, and we wanted to listen respectfully. So I think that to kind of sum up what it is Patrick is saying in this video, 7 Pieces of Evidence that Francis is an anti-pope, is that essentially there's been a kind of plot or conspiracy, and that at the center of it is Pope Benedict. That Pope Benedict, at least possibly, or one of the reasonable explanations that Patrick is pointing to is that Pope Benedict might have allowed for a false pope to sit on the throne for a time. You want to hear a little clip about that?
Yeah.
Okay, let's hear the clip.
And in his very first homily as the Roman pontiff, Benedict asked for prayers that he might not flee out of fear of the wolves. You remember that? Did that catch your attention? It got my attention. Think about it. Maybe he didn't flee the wolves. Maybe he outfoxed them. 2 things are certain. First, if his abdication was intentionally false, it was a masterstroke, pure genius, because it revealed all the corruption that he knew was simmering just below the surface of the church's life, but he was too weak to confront it. Second, our Lord Jesus Christ has not left us orphans.
Well, the first thing to say about that from my perspective, and then I'll let you approach it, I cannot reconcile that view without thinking that means that Pope Benedict lied.
Yes.
And I do not believe that Pope Benedict would lie in a grave matter.
Yeah, it sounds more like a Tom Cruise film than it does like the actions of a Catholic pope. In this conspiracy theory, Benedict is actually a bad actor for a good cause, but he's acting
he's doing
wickedly
good
to try to bring good about, which if you know
doing
anything
evil that
about
good
Catholic
may come.
theology, anything about Joseph Ratzinger, Benedict XVI, that's not him at all. And that's not us at all. That it's impossible that could be what's going on here if you take seriously the prohibition against lying. But also, like, let's just draw out the idea that this is some kind of really elaborate sting operation, that we didn't know who the bad actors were in the church, and Benedict had to pretend to resign to get them to come out of the woodwork. That isn't true on its face, first of all. I mean, many of the people who we view as bad actors now, we viewed as bad actors then. And there's just basic problems with, like, how much of a sword does the Pope wield? Does he, do you excommunicate everyone who you disagree with even a little bit? Or are there limits in which you just wait for a guy, hope he repents? Those are prudential questions. You don't need a fake resignation to realize, Cardinal Daniels doesn't agree with Cardinal Burke on many things.
Right.
But then finally, it's been almost 9 years now. So if this is a sting operation, we're just waiting for the Pope to say, surprise, I'm still the Pope, and this, I don't understand exactly how, in a fake resignation, Benedict knew his successor would be Francis and knew that this would draw out all of the bad actors in the church in the first place. You have to really do a whole lot of legwork to even make this conspiracy theory coherent, that he's intentionally pretending to resign for dubious reasons.
Yeah.
And you have to have, basically, he would have had to know in the future about, well, here's who they would choose if I resigned today. And here's what these bad actors are going to do if they think Pope Francis is the Pope. And here's what, like, it, to say it doesn't make sense is kind of an understatement. That it doesn't work, it wouldn't work as a movie. It doesn't work as real life at all.
7 pieces of evidence that Francis is an anti-pope. As we watched it, it seemed that there were 8 actual pieces of evidence marshaled. So we'll. I think what the thing to do then is, okay, if the conclusion that Patrick comes to is that it's at least possible that this was a fake resignation on the part of Pope Benedict, that does seem to provide a kind of hermeneutical key, like a way of, okay,
that's the conclusion he's coming to.
Yeah, right. So okay,
how's he getting there?
Yeah. So let's look at the actual evidence and see what we think with 7 points, and then what we thought is an 8th point.
If I may, just to do him justice, he's open to the idea this is an elaborate sting operation. The other thesis that he seems to be kind of half advancing is maybe Pope Benedict doesn't know he's the Pope, which is also just, we'll just say, uncharted territory. We've never had a situation where someone was unwittingly unaware of the Pope while strenuously denying they were the Pope and trying to resign. And I would suggest this is also an impossibility, that the Pope has the ability to resign. You're not going to catch him in some kind of legalistic trap where he has to stay Pope against his will and against what he's explicitly stated. So you've got 2 theses that he's sort of advancing. He's not totally married, as far as I can tell, to either one.
No,
one sting operation, 2 unknown Pope. Like, no one, even Benedict, realizes it, but he's still the Pope.
Okay, so Joe, how about we just take a look at Patrick's arguments? We'll try to follow the argument through. Let's play the next clip, please.
In this video, I present 7 pieces of evidence that Jorge Mario Bergoglio, the former Cardinal Archbishop of Buenos Aires, who is now called Pope Francis, is an anti-pope. Now, you can rewind it, but I said anti-pope. I don't mean bad pope, although there's lots of bad to be had, and I don't mean antichrist, although him being a remote dress rehearsal for the antichrist makes a lot of sense. An anti-pope is a man falsely believed to be the pope, but is not duly, validly elected to the chair of Peter.
In all fairness, but let's just address that. He's not calling him the Antichrist or a bad pope.
Although he does seem to think he might be the dress rehearsal for the Antichrist.
Right.
So he certainly has a negative view, shall we say, of Pope Francis.
I got to say, in the last few years, a lot of stuff seems like a dress rehearsal for the Antichrist. Like, it seems like a lot of this could come in handy later if someone wanted to make use of it. But and I'm not saying that to dismiss it. I mean that quite sincerely.
Yeah, although it's not a new phenomenon. E. Primi, Pius X, makes the same point in like the 1910s.
Yeah.
That you have these stirrings that seem to be foreboding something wicked about to happen. That seems like the arrival of the Antichrist into the world.
Yeah.
And so if that's been the situation for more than a century now,
it's
understandable. First of all, it's understandable
Maybe
that people
pay attention.
are disconcerted. Well, true.
That's what I'm thinking.
But we also shouldn't be too quick to maybe jump the gun.
Okay, so the anti-pope
yes.
thing, though, and one of the things that Patrick will do here, and we won't play the clip because it's long, is say this is actually common. We've had lots of anti-popes, so I'm not really breaking new ground here.
Yeah, I think that's not true.
Okay.
Meaning, in the past, it's true. There are people who have claimed to be pope who weren't. But what he's suggesting, either of the two theses, is that someone who didn't claim to be pope was. So it's actually the inversion of the ordinary course, where normally you have two
an
guys.
anti-pope is the guy who says, I'm pope, but he's not.
Right.
Not a guy who says, I'm not the pope. But he is.
So his claim
Oh,
is that Benedict is in this kind of weird inversion of an anti-pope, where he doesn't think he's the pope or says he's not the pope. He's either lying or deluded about being the pope. Says he isn't, but actually is, which is this strange inversion. That is unprecedented. I mean, whatever you make of his thesis, that's never happened. We don't have any kind of precedent for that kind of thing in the history of the church, where the real pope doesn't know he's the pope and says he's not the pope. Papal resignations are valid. And so to invalidate a papal resignation, he's got a high evidentiary burden, we'll say, to try to show the case he's trying to show. But it's clear. I want to be fair to his argument for what it is. He's not a sede vacantist. He's not saying the chair is empty. If anything, he thinks it's overcrowded.
Yeah, the chair's crowded, right? Okay, fair enough. So how about we take a look at the 7?
Please.
Okay, so a couple of them I would argue, items 1 and 4 on his list of 7 are essentially etiquette questions, and that so I want to dispense with those first, if I could. So could you just review points 1 and 4?
So the first point he makes is that the term Pope Emeritus is confusing and has no precedent.
Yes.
And then he has this kind of inapplicable comparison to President Nixon if he stayed in the White House. It doesn't really work for a few reasons, one of which is that Vatican City is a sovereign city-state. And, it isn't like the Pope is still staying in the papal, not the Pope Emeritus is staying in the papal portion of Vatican City. It's more like if Nixon retired to D.C. And then, so it doesn't really work as an analogy. But then his fourth point is that Pope Benedict's correct form of address is still Your Holiness. Now, I want to give credence to the merit of this argument, which is this. When Benedict announced his resignation, we kind of had this collective moment in the church where we said, well, what do we do now? How do we call him? How should he dress?
Right. How are we supposed to
go back?
This?
And he didn't know.
Yeah.
Meaning, he wanted to be called Cardinal Ratzinger again and was actually persuaded against it. And so the question of how do you dress? How are you called? All of those things. There hadn't been a papal resignation in half a millennium. And so, more than that, I mean, the last time a pope resigned was before Protestants existed. That's how far back you've got to go. And so we can say two things. Number one, we know from church history that popes can resign. And number two, that still left a lot of questions we didn't have clear answers to. So like St. Celestine V, after he resigns, he ends up being imprisoned by his successor to make sure he doesn't rise up and form some kind of other sect. And that obviously isn't the only way of handling things, Francis doesn't have
maybe
to
not
imprison.
even the best way of handling things.
Arguably not a good way.
Yeah.
Putting this, monastic kind of pope in a prison cell when all he wanted to do was go back to his monastery and pray for the church. I don't know. It was one of those things that we were dealing with uncharted territory. So maybe there's a better way of signifying Pope Emeritus than we've found.
Maybe even a better term than Pope Emeritus.
Exactly. But we have a model for this, not in the papacy, but in the episcopacy. Meaning, with the average lifespan getting older and older, and the introduction of mandatory retirement ages in canon law, there's a growing number of elderly former bishops, and they're often referred to as Bishop Emeritus. Now, they also will be given a titular see, where they're the bishop of such and such a place that doesn't exist anymore. But they're known colloquially and commonly as Bishop Emeritus. In my own diocese, Archbishop Naumann is the bishop, and Archbishop Emeritus Kelleher is the former archbishop. And so it raises all sorts of questions. At Mass, when you're praying for the Pope and for the bishop, some priests will insert and the Bishop Emeritus. All of those are questions we're still working out, even at the level of the episcopacy, for non-conspiratorial reasons, just because in the old days, the way you stopped being a bishop or the pope is that you died.
Yeah.
And often at a young age, quite frequently, violently.
Yeah.
Now, there's more people who are retired. And it isn't the teaching of the Catholic Church that you have to stay in office until you die, especially if you're mentally infirm or physically infirm. The church is actually very clear on the opposite.
But it is the teaching of the Catholic Church that a pope and a bishop and even the pastor of a local parish, these are not just administrative or juridical roles. These are fatherly roles. And we don't want to just... See, this is where I think part of the problem may arise from, is you want to make clear he's not the pope, but you also want to make clear he never stops being the papa. Like, he never loses. And so like Bishop Emeritus in your archdiocese is
Kelleher, James Patrick Kelleher.
Kelleher. Well, you don't want to just like, put him on an ice floe and send him like he's still a revered and important part of the community, and that role never goes away.
Exactly.
And
it doesn't go away. It would stress, especially with the papacy, doesn't go away even with death, which is why we say things like Pope St. John Paul II.
Right.
We don't say Pope Emeritus St. John Paul II. We don't go back to calling him like Karol Wojtyła.
Yeah. But now we're in a weird position where this came up earlier, where right now Pope Benedict is Pope Emeritus Benedict. When he dies, he'll go back to being Pope Benedict.
And so in a strange way, it actually would probably be most accurate to continue to call him Pope Benedict.
Yeah. Even now. But the problem
is that people would not understand this distinction.
Right. Like, so should he be wearing white after he leaves office? Should he be, should there be another word besides Pope Emeritus? Patrick's perfectly reasonable to raise these, and maybe we're getting it all wrong. Maybe we're getting it all wrong now.
These
Who
are
knows?
questions he asked, and the questions canonists asked, questions theologians asked, about how do we best signify this reality that we have had a hard time. Now, these are things, I want to be really clear. Being the Pope is a totally different reality than just like wearing a white cassock. Norbertines and Dominicans wear a white cassock and aren't the Pope. If the Pope decides to wear different clothes one day, he doesn't stop being the Pope. These are trappings, the titles, all of this stuff. They're symbols of how do we best express the reality.
Right.
And maybe at the symbolic level, we could be doing a better job. But that has literally nothing to do with Pope Benedict being validly the Pope or not.
Right.
That's the question that we're asking. So let's make a really clear distinction, because this is going to come up in several of the arguments that he raises. As you said, there's a real spiritual fatherhood. Pope means papa. It means father. And when you're the father of the Church of Rome and of the global church, that spiritual fatherhood doesn't just dissipate upon your resignation or your death. You continue to pray for them. You continue to intercede for them. And that goes on forever. Yeah. And, so right now, you can bet that all of the popes in heaven continue to intercede on behalf of the church, continue to pray for the church. For the same reason, by the way, that like St. Joseph is called the protector of the universal church, because it was his job to protect the church on earth in the first century. That he has to take care of Jesus, the head, Mary, the body, at the time when the church is just those two people. He's made the head of, the protector of the church in that sense, not the head in like a papal sense, but he's given a sort of spiritual authority, and the church continues that to, still continue on today, which is why he's the patron of the universal church. Well, so it is here, that even though the juridical office of the papacy is no longer inhabited by Benedict or St. Peter or St. Pius X or whoever you want, if they're in heaven or if they're on earth praying for the church, they continue to have that real spiritual relationship.
I think it's important that you say about popes if they're in heaven.
Yes, I remember my Dante.
Okay, so the marks of the papacy that are unconfusing, that all the trappings of the papacy have accrued to Pope Francis. Most importantly, the liturgical trappings, and that this is not just something to sneeze at.
Yeah, so let's make a really clear distinction. Patrick Kaufman's arguments are these technical, nuanced, and I'm just going to say legalistic kind of arguments. He's going to argue that Pope Benedict resigns the munus but not the he resigns the ministerium but not the munus of the papacy. These are Latin synonyms. This is a subtle legalistic argument that an ordinary person doesn't have any framework in which to understand this distinction. Yes.
No, I'm.
Yeah, I know you're volunteering.
Yeah.
Instead, it's really easy. Because here's the thing, and this is the thing that I think a lot of Protestants get wrong. It's not a trick or a trap. It isn't like true Christianity is something that like only one or two people have figured out. And so the obvious answer is the right answer when it comes to this.
Yeah.
That the Catholic Church is the true church is the easy answer. And God wants it to be the easy answer. St. Optatus of Milevis, or Optatus of Milevis if you prefer, and Against the Donatists, Book 2, Chapter 4, gives a really simple test. Now this is back in like the early 4th century, so the early 300s. He's writing against the Donatists, and he points out that they are out of union with the Bishop of Rome, and so they're schismatics. And he then responds to an objection. He says, but you allege that you too have some sort of a party in the city of Rome. It is a branch of your error growing out of a lie, not from the root of truth. In a word, were Macrobius, that's the guy they have in Rome, to be asked where he sits in the city, will he be able to say on Peter's cathedra? That's, the seat, the chair. I doubt whether he's even set eyes upon it, and schismatic that he is, he has not drawn nigh to Peter's shrine. And then he goes on to say, behold, in Rome are the shrines of the two apostles. Will you tell me whether he has been able to approach them, or has offered sacrifice in those places where, as is certain, are the shrines of the saints? So to put that in maybe more modern English, if you want to know who the Bishop of Rome is, who's the Pope, well, it's the guy who celebrates Mass, St. Peter's, St. Paul's outside the walls. Those are his churches. It's that easy.
Yeah.
And who's got the authority to do that? Who's got the right to do that? Pope Francis, undeniably.
Right.
Even if you think someone else should be the Pope, if you just say, okay, who's making rules at St. Peter's? Who's the one restricting, masses at the side altars? Well, it's Pope Francis, because this is his church to do with as he will. I mean, St. Peter's there. By the historic way, we could tell who the Pope is very clearly. Pope Francis is the Pope. And the point here is that this is the obvious answer. Early on, even before the fight against Donatism, you have the fight against Gnosticism. The Gnostics claim Jesus had like a public set of teachings and then a secret set of teachings for the special few.
Right.
And the Christian response is, this is hogwash.
That's not how it works.
Yeah, that Jesus is trying to get everyone to know the truth. He's not going to make it super hard to figure out. You got to have the decoder ring on just right to understand.
Yes.
So anytime you come across this stuff, Bible codes, where it's like every 17th letter means this, all of that stuff is way too Gnostic. And this is way too Gnostic. Making these subtle, in Latin, this declension. No, stop. You're making it too complicated.
Yeah.
Christianity is easy, which is why we're Catholic. Knowing who the Pope is easy. Knowing which is the true church is easy. And the church fathers are actually emphatic on this, that even if you find other groups claiming to be Catholic, if you go into a random town and say, where's the Catholic Church? Even the non-Catholics will point to the Roman Catholic Church.
Yeah.
All of that points to this reality. So the same argument can be used against everybody. Anglo-Catholics claiming to be Catholic, Protestants saying that the true church is super hard to find, but it's their 17th split off of a denomination. All of it can be answered with this same simple point. Jesus makes it easy to find the true church. It is the mustard tree, the successor of St. Peter who celebrates Mass at the tombs of Peter and Paul. There's your guy. Be in union with him. And we know that guy is Pope Francis.
All right. So then points 2 and 3 have to do with the nature of the ex-pope. That there is, in addition to the etiquette questions about why is he wearing white, why is he addressed as His Holiness or Your Holiness, those are all pope-like things, popish. Papal.
There it is.
But no, what I was, but okay, I fair enough. So there are more profound questions of what is the nature of this role, and he gets to that in points 2 and 3.
Yeah, and I've sort of teed up some of that. So in point 2, he claims that Benedict resigns the ministerium, but not the munus of the papacy.
Right.
In point 3, he's especially looking at a speech that Archbishop Ganswein gave, where he talks about an active member and a contemplative member. But Genswein is also super clear in his speech that he doesn't think that there are two popes. He thinks there's one pope and one person who shares in the Petrine ministry, but isn't the pope, in the sense that we mean. And I get that that's confusing.
It is confusing.
Another way of saying that is like, well, how many popes are there? In one sense, there's one Pope Francis. In another sense, there's 265.
Yeah.
Because everyone who's ever held that office shares in that Petrine ministry. What do we mean by that? Well, go back to the early church, the Council of Chalcedon. When Pope Leo intercedes with what's called the Tome of Leo, the Council Fathers, both Eastern and Western, respond that Peter has spoken through Leo. What they mean there is that even though one guy, Pope Leo, is the valid pope in the juridical sense, the sense of who's making the day-to-day kind of calls, in the spiritual sense of this Petrine succession, Peter continues to intercede and he continues to work through his successors. So just as Benedict will continue to safeguard and protect the church after his death, he continues spiritually to do that in this contemplative role. So he's not making day-to-day calls. And he may not even agree with all the day-to-day calls that are made, but his role is to pray for the Holy Father and to intercede for him in this unique kind of privileged place. So that's, I think, what we should understand, both this Ministerium Munis kind of distinction and this speech by Archbishop Genswein. And I think the other thing to say is, like, none of the validity of this is going to turn on, well, a guy who knew the Pope gave a speech that was potentially confusing. Worst case scenario, just say, well, maybe he should have had a speechwriter.
Or maybe he's just wrong.
Right.
Like maybe his conception of it is wrong. That would be fine too.
And so all of that's to say, none of that invalidates his resignation. If you're looking at evidence that Pope Francis isn't the true Pope because Benedict couldn't validly resign properly or didn't validly resign because he was like part of a secret plan, none of those, he crossed his fingers behind his back before he said he resigned kind of theories hold water. You need something a lot more substantive than that. Because look, the other thing, and I think this is worth just saying, because the first 6 of the 7 or 8 points that he makes are all about the validity of Benedict's resignation.
Yes.
And so I want to just give you a little bit of the canon law here. Because in Canon 332, it makes it clear it is super easy for a pope to resign. And here's why. Because the first see, the Holy See, is judged by no one. The Pope doesn't have to report to his superiors, submit his 2 weeks' notice, and wait for them to approve it. He has no superiors on earth. And so, Canon 332, Section 1 says, the Roman pontiff obtains full and supreme power in the church by his acceptance of a legitimate election together with episcopal consecration. And then it explains how to ordain someone if you elect someone who's not a bishop yet. None of that applies here. Section 2 says, if it happens that the Roman pontiff resigns his office, it is required for validity that the resignation is made freely and properly manifested, but not that it is accepted by anyone. So in other words, he doesn't have to tender his resignation to anyone. All that's required is that he freely resigns. In other words, if you put a gun to the Pope's head and say, sign this or else.
That's not a valid resignation.
Exactly. That's, if it's done with coercion, if you're trying to, you torture the Pope.
Or even if the Pope is mentally incapacitated and you just said, sign here, but he didn't know.
Right.
That would not be free.
But Pope Benedict has repeatedly, including in his resignation itself, stressed that this is a free resignation. So the people claiming he's still the Pope have to say he's either deluded or he's lying about it being a free resignation. And so I think I just stress, the bar for validity is so low that you would have to have some overwhelming evidence. Someone was torturing him while this happened, and we've got the video. But there's nothing like it's like, well, he worded it in kind of a weird way. First, he didn't. They've overthought it. But second, that's not good enough. That's not even close to enough evidence to throw into question the validity of the election.
He had an intention. He made the intention clear. The intention was accepted by everybody.
And that's all. In fact, even the intention being accepted by everybody isn't even strictly required. But it was.
Right. But it's
all the cardinals, the ones who loved him, the ones who hated him, everybody came together. They participated in a conclave. Nobody sat out saying, I don't think he really resigned. Everybody knew this was a valid resignation.
I imagine that there's not that many people who love Pope Francis who are making this argument. It seems to me that this is related to a real disappointment of Pope Francis and maybe a sense that there's just something wrong with this whole Francis papacy. Okay, so that's so when we have that kind of experience of something, this is really disappointing. I don't like this at all. We sometimes cope. This is through legalism.
Yes,
and I think that's what. And I'll give you an example. A couple of years ago, the New Orleans Saints won the National Football Conference championship, and then it was taken away from them by the most obvious bad call in the history of football. And so there's people say, well, they won it. Really, they are the champions. And there's people, they mean it, but they're not.
Yeah. St. Louis Cardinals fans, if you mention the call to them, they know that you mean the Game 6 call in 1985, in which, what's his name, Don Denneker, the umpire, first base umpire in the Kansas City Royals-Cardinals game, calls a Royals player safe who is very clearly out at the top of the ninth inning. The Royals go on to win that game. The Cardinals fans were so upset about this that they lost the next game. It's like they just gave up.
Yeah. So
that's
legally,
a
these
loser.
Things, like by the rules of the game, these things are wrong. These are bad calls. This shouldn't have happened to probably should have happened to the Cardinals, but it shouldn't have. I don't know. But it shouldn't have.
That's more
happened
confusing here when we're talking about Catholic
to the
Cardinals.
Saints. Okay, but that kind of legalism does not establish what actually happened in the real world.
Yes. I mean, look at the last several elections in the U.S. The losing side always has some reason why their guy technically deserved to win or why the other guy technically deserved to lose. Allegations of voter fraud or Russian interference or hanging chads. Hanging chads. Those ones are actually legitimately difficult questions. Like, the hanging chads actually went to the Supreme Court. Most of these, even if it's really clear, even if your guy gets trounced, the losing side will always say, well, on a technicality, doesn't matter how much Obama destroyed McCain by. He was born maybe in Kenya.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
Those kind of things, like actually just win the election.
Yeah.
Actually just like persuade other people. But when we don't want to do that, we try to find some technical, legalistic reason why why our side is right and the other side's wrong.
Which
and you
brings us
see
to
this
point
all
5.
over. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so
point 5 is the most egregious example of this. He argues there's 3 errors in the Latin in the papal resignation.
Errors in the Latin of
Benedict's resignation.
Yeah.
And to that I would just say, even if that's true, literally who cares?
Yeah, it literally doesn't matter.
You can find errors. Go on the Vatican's website. I could point you to several translation errors and things. They're frequent. This is not uncommon, and it has no weight, no bearing whatsoever. This is the equivalent of Wesley Snipes saying he doesn't have to pay taxes because some versions of the 16th Amendment had grammatical difference from other versions. It's a bad argument legally. It's a worse argument theologically. That's not how the real world works. It doesn't turn on like, well, in this copy you put a comma here, and in that copy you put it there, or like you have it in the accusative declension. It's
called omissions and errors, right? Like it's a basic part of okay. So you made, but if it's incidental, it doesn't matter.
It would be like saying, these 2 synoptic translations. Matthew says this, Mark says this very similar thing, because they have these slight variations in how they express Jesus' words. Can't really say what he said, so we'll just throw it all out.
Yeah.
It doesn't work. Like, that's a bad argument against Christianity. It's a bad argument against Benedict's resignation. That we expect that there's going to be these minor differences, and who cares? It doesn't matter.
Point number 6 is there wasn't a universal peaceful acceptance of this election of Pope Francis.
Now, that is a very obscure kind of theory. So Cardinal Louis Billot, I believe is how you pronounce it. It's French, and as anyone who's a long-time listener knows, I'm a terrible French pronouncer. Yeah. Speaking of grammatical errors, said this basically just to break down the thesis, and other people have said it before. I think it goes back to John of St. Thomas, that there are some elections that are going to be harder. You have a conclave, and then 2 people come out, and one of them claims to be the Pope, and then another one also claims to be the Pope, or claims the election wasn't valid and they need to redo it. You'll occasionally have those in the history of the church. The most difficult of those was the so-called papal schism, or papal schism, that you have 2 and then 3 people claiming to be the Pope, and there's a lot of confusion.
And even saints were on both sides.
Right. Those are the hard cases.
Yeah.
The easy cases are where everyone says this one guy's the Pope. You don't have to take a closer look in those cases. You have to take a closer look in the hard cases.
But either way, there is a legitimate Pope in both cases.
Right. And
one of them is just hard to tell.
And so far as we can tell, Optatus's test of which one's in Rome saying Mass at the tomb of Peter and Paul,
has
It's
always
actually
held up.
really good, yeah, because it was the Roman line
Yeah.
in the case of the Papal Schism. So in Cardinal Below test, his argument is if you've got universal peaceful acceptance of the election, you have an infallible sign of the validity. That it doesn't matter if you could go back and second guess this or that decision in the process, because you can always do that. In every election, you can say, well, was every cardinal acting in good faith? Or, here's this grammatical thing over there. You can literally always do that. And you'll be able to do that in the next papal election. I'm just calling it right now. And you'll be able to do that in every election for the rest of your life. That's a terrible way to live your life as a Catholic. The guy everyone knows is the Pope, is the easier way of expressing universal peaceful acceptance. If you ask Siri or ask Alexa, who is the Pope, they'll tell you Pope Francis. Yeah. If you ask Pope Benedict, who is the Pope, he'll tell you Pope Francis. If you ask Pope Francis, if you ask a Catholic or a non-Catholic, overwhelmingly, they're going to tell you Pope Francis. Now, in response to this, Patrick Coffin says, well, I thought he was weird from the beginning. That's not an argument. I think for a couple of reasons. First of all, universal doesn't mean literally every single person on earth has to agree. It just means the in the same way when we're talking about development of doctrine, about what's always been believed by everyone everywhere, you can find heretics who didn't believe it. We don't mean it literally like every soul under heaven.
Right.
Like St. Vincent's canon, if you're familiar with that. But likewise here, the fact that you found him weird doesn't mean he wasn't validly the Pope. That's not what universal peaceful acceptance means. The fact that it's not peaceful in the sense you don't like him doesn't mean that he's not validly the Pope. Everyone knows he's the Pope is basically the standard. And I think by that standard, you have enough to say, infallibly, we can know this is the Pope.
Yeah, and there were no cardinals who stood up and said, no, he's not the Pope. There was no...
There's like two bishops, I think. There's a couple of a retired bishop who thinks maybe Benedict is still the Pope, but it is incredibly French. You don't have a faction, and significantly, you don't have a claimant because Benedict doesn't claim to be the Pope.
There you go. Okay, so that's a very interesting point. All right, so point number 7, and then we will get to what we think is point number 8.
Yeah,
here.
so let's mark. We're transitioning here. The first 6 points are all about the resignation. Now he's going to turn to, well, regardless of the resignation, is the election of Pope Francis valid?
And here he says that, and he does some quoting of Pope John Paul, who in the late 90s rewrote the rules for the election of a pope, but also in the context of rewriting the rules, gave instructions, basically. It said, look, this is how it, and this is the spirit in which it should be done and all of that. And he says that there's a group that called the St. Galen Mafia, who, and there is such a group, but he's saying they cheated and they didn't follow Pope John Paul II's rules.
Yeah. So what he's doing is he's taking this 1996 Apostolic Constitution out of context. What he does is he blends together paragraph 79 and 81, and then goes to 82, and then tries to top it off with what would sound to anyone listening like the conclusion, but is actually way back up in 76. And it's a very misleading presentation of what St. John Paul II has to say. So I will kind of recap. I mean, you can listen to him give it, but I'll give a basic recap. He says in paragraph 79. Now, I want to mention in paragraph 79, 81, and 82, he's dealing with what he calls matters to be observed or avoided in the election of the Roman pontiff. And some of these are literally just advisory. They're him encouraging you as pope to do or not do certain things. For instance, he says if you get elected pope, he encourages you to accept that election. You're free not to. You're free to say, I decline the election as pope. He's just giving you spiritual encouragement that God will give you the grace even if you don't see how you could possibly be the pope. But we know that a man is free to decline the papacy. It's happened before. It can happen again. But he's also warning against certain things. So in 79, he forbids anyone, even if he's a cardinal, during the Pope's lifetime without consulting him, to make plans concerning the election of his successor, or to promise votes, or to make decisions in this regard in private gatherings. Now, he says there he's confirming the prescriptions of his predecessors. Now, taken at a literal, legalistic level, that would invalidate the document itself. Meaning, John Paul II is preparing for the election of his successor by laying out the procedure for the successor,
Right.
That's not what he's talking about.
What's he
He's
talking
talking
about?
about like a conspiracy. Like, okay, here's our guy. We're going to like finagle to get him.
Yeah.
But regularly, you'll have Catholics who say, I'd really like to see this person become the next pope. The term papabile is there for a reason. And this is really widespread. Now, maybe they shouldn't do that. It doesn't invalidate the election of Pope Francis. The Cardinal Ratzinger fan club that thought it would be great if Ratzinger became pope, and then he did, that didn't invalidate his election. But there's two other parts that are really critical about this. He looks at paragraph 81 and 82. 82 just says not to make any promises, like any quid pro quo kind of deals. And if you do, they're not legally binding. Like if someone says, I'll vote for you if you promise to do this, and you say, okay. John Paul II says, that's not binding.
Yeah.
You can't be kind of forced into a quid pro quo in exchange for the papacy. In 81, he says, the cardinal elector shall further abstain from any form of pact, agreement, promise, or other commitment of any kind, which could oblige them to give or deny their vote to a person or persons. If this were in fact done, even under oath, I declare that such a commitment shall be null and void, and that no one shall be bound to observe it. And I hereby impose the penalty of excommunication, latae sententiae, upon those who violate this prohibition. It is not my intention, however, to forbid, during the period in which the see is vacant, the exchange of views concerning the election. So let's talk about what's forbidden and what's permitted by John Paul II's schema there. What's forbidden is this old thing that we had in the church for a long time, where certain Catholic heads of state, specifically the Holy Roman Emperor, had a national veto. And we saw this exercised most controversially in the papal election of 1903. That a man, one of the cardinals, was elected by a majority, but the Holy Roman Emperor didn't like him, and so demanded that his cardinals, or the cardinals in his country, exercise this veto to prevent his election. They actually refused to, but one of the Polish cardinals exercised that veto on behalf of the head of state. That kind of national interference in election is noxious, even by a Catholic head of state. And so the man who ended up winning that election on the next ballot, St. Pius X, quickly got rid of and forbade that national veto. That's the kind of meddling we're talking about. An outside party, to take a modern example, if the Chinese government says, Cardinal Zen, you are required to vote for this candidate and you're required not to vote for that candidate, that kind of outside meddling is strictly forbidden. And the meddler is excommunicated. That is a very, very different thing from saying, I think you should support this candidate. I think they'd be really good. That's permitted. And not only is that permitted, that's explicitly permitted. That it is not my intention, however, to forbid, during the period in which the see is vacant, the exchange of views concerning the election. In other words, this whole thing, the St. Gallen Mafia, as it's called, or the St. Gallen Group, or the Circle of Friends, as they call themselves, which actually sounds the most mafia-like of all of those.
That's the scariest one. Yeah. Right.
It was a group of, I think it's fair to say, more liberal-leaning bishops and cardinals in the church who would get together and spend time in St. Gallen, I think Switzerland. And there were only 3 of them, or 4 of them, who were still of voting age by the time the conclave came about. So they were not a majority. Anyone suggesting, like, they controlled the election. This is 3 or 4 votes. They liked Cardinal Bergoglio. They probably had voted for him in the election in which Pope Benedict won, and he had probably declined, even though John Paul II would have said, don't decline. And then he accepted the second, in the second election. In that case, they might have encouraged everyone around them to vote for Cardinal Bergoglio, but that's literally what happens at a conclave. In other words, at a conclave, it's not like everyone votes and then it just turns out one person on the first round of ballots got 2/3. Rarely do, a majority or 2/3 of the cardinals agree on who they think would be the number one pick. So I might say, here are the 3 guys I would like to see as Pope. Here are the 3 guys you'd like to see. Which one has the best prospect of winning? Who should we really support here? That kind of stuff happens at a conclave. This is why it's a conclave and not just everyone votes from home. You're meant to convene. You're meant to be in conclave. And the exchange of ideas is not forbidden, but encouraged. And that includes ideas, not just about who would be an ideal, but who's an actually electable kind of candidate. Maybe I love Cardinal Burke, but I know he's not going to get more than 1 or 2 votes.
Yeah.
Okay, so I decide, I also like this other cardinal over here. That sort of thing is explicitly permitted. So to the extent the accusation is that cardinals we didn't like, conspired by trying to get other people to support Bergoglio, that's literally what they're supposed to do. We may not like the direction they exercise their influence. That's not a crime.
Yes.
They're not excommunicated, and that doesn't invalidate the election, which leads to the last point on this kind of 1996 Apostolic Constitution. Patrick quotes this line: "Should the election take place in a way other than that prescribed in the present Constitution, or should the conditions laid down here not be observed, the election is for this very reason null and void, without any need for declaration on the matter. Consequently, it confers no right on the one elected." Now, that sounds really ominous in light of all the paragraphs we just saw. Like, oh, what if somebody does a thing the Pope told them not to do? Here's the problem. That line doesn't come at the end of this section. That line was well before it. That line comes in paragraph 76. This is really important. So, section 5 of the document, this is paragraph 62 to 77, lays out the election procedure. Okay. And if you don't follow the election procedure, you do something really weird, you don't actually have the election, you do something else, that's not a papal election.
Yeah. So right. So we just flip a coin.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Something like that.
No, that's not a valid election.
Right.
There was a procedure for electing the Pope, and you didn't follow it.
And then after that kind of warning, you then turn in section 6, beginning with paragraph 78, to matters to be observed or avoided in the election of the Roman pontiff. In other words, while you have a valid election, how should you conduct yourself as individual cardinals, and in a way that does justice to your calling? That has nothing to do with the validity of the election. In the same way that we can say, here's how to have a valid U.S. election, and then we can say, and also get out and vote. That get out and vote does not mean if someone doesn't vote, therefore the whole U.S. presidential election is invalid.
Especially because it became after the declaration that if you don't do these things.
And one section is clearly labeled as the procedure, and one section is clearly labeled as like rules of conduct.
Okay.
For how individuals should conduct themselves.
All right. I think we've covered that one.
So, So I think that's the most common kind of objection that you'll hear for why Pope Francis isn't validly the Pope. You always have to get to like the papal resignation stuff, but even if he resigned validly, people say, well, it doesn't matter. Maybe there just is no Pope because we can't accept this election. And it's based on a fundamentally, I would even go so far as to say, dishonest read of the document, in that it's moving paragraphs around in places they aren't to try to make them say something that they don't.
So let's do some audio now, because we were saying that, Patrick gives us 7 pieces of evidence that Francis is an anti-pope, but there's kind of an 8th, and so this is the 8th. Let's hear that audio.
Catholics who are absolutely resistant to the possibility that Francis is our latest anti-pope are in a bind. They have to keep defending, have to keep domesticating and explaining away the words and deeds of the one person in the world most responsible for destroying the reputation and integrity of the Catholic faith.
Okay, so that what we might call, I don't know, it's a little bit, you might call that an emotional appeal, but there is an argument there.
It goes on from there for a few minutes of just him saying, here's a bad thing that you don't like, here's a bad thing you don't like that Pope Francis did.
How can you explain that?
Right.
And the fact is, I think that he's wrong about our obligation to explain it.
Yes, it's very much the same argument that an atheist says, well, how can you believe in a loving God? How do you explain cancer? How do you explain this kid who dies in a fire? And the answer in both cases is, I can't. I don't need to, though.
Right.
Because it's not impossible that there's a reason I don't know why Jesus is permitting a certain thing to happen. So there's really 2 levels here. One is that some of the things that are on this long litany, he mentions that like the head of Pfizer met with Pope Francis. That's just not a scandal. Even people who may be morally odious, meet with the Pope regularly. You'll have no shortage of those examples with every Pope that they've, but was it Leo or Gregory who met with Attila the Hun? I mean, you won't have any shortage. And then he even throws in the line, we can only speculate about whether money exchanged hands, which is just outright calumny.
You should not say something like that.
Like maybe he bribed him. Like that's unhinged. I'm sorry, but that crosses such a clear line of Christian charity. Oh, well, maybe the Pope accepted money from Attila the Hun, too. Maybe, here's some letters to Genghis Khan. Maybe the Pope was secretly currying favor. No, just stop. You deserve better than that as a Christian, and you owe your neighbor, especially your neighbor who's your spiritual father, better than that as a Christian. Even if you don't believe Pope Francis is the Pope,
Yeah.
even a Protestant owes...
Don't accuse him of taking a bribe.
Exactly. That's such a base allegation for which there's literally zero evidence other than that a person who has money met with the Pope, which if that's your standard, every Pope throughout history must have taken bribes because all of them encountered rich people.
Okay, but there are things that a reasonable person might find quite scandalous about Pope Francis.
Absolutely.
And might be quite actually scandalized about. That is, a person at home, I don't know, who really, teaches natural family planning, has lived natural family planning, has a good, sized family. I don't know, a big family, 9 kids, 10 kids.
Rabbit-sized.
And then the Pope says on an airplane, Catholics don't have to breed like rabbits. Might find that cruel and insulting that the Pope said
yes,
that.
it's discouraging at the very least.
And discouraging, yes.
Because especially when it does hit close to home. Because
it's not technically
sounds
wrong. I mean, no one has to breed like a rabbit. No, right? You're a human being. But but it's still like that scandalizes people. So I don't want to just focus on the ones that Patrick might be wrong about. But what about what he's right about? And he says, if you're going to say that this is a legitimate Pope, how do you explain that?
Yeah, and I think it's fair to say. Well, I guess I want to give a nuanced kind of answer to it. I want to say there's a few categories. One are things that the Pope just wasn't wrong about. 2 would be things that the Pope seems like he's wrong about, but maybe have been taken out of context. 3 are things that I think he's wrong about because I'm wrong and I actually need to learn from him. But 4, and there's a reason I'm leading with those 3, because I don't want to just assume every time I disagree with him, I'm right and he's wrong. But there are times when I think I'm right and he's wrong. There are times where I think that was the wrong thing to do. And that's not new. We've got John Paul II license plates, but I think kissing the Quran when he's overseas was a huge blunder. Yeah. And I think the Assisi conference was inadvertently a desecration of holy places. I think it was well-intentioned and totally misguided. I think there are times when even holy people sin. And you know who else teaches that? The Catholic Church.
Yeah.
That there's 2 sides of a coin here that I think we have to be very cautious of. There are people who, in their attempt to defend the papacy, think they need to defend everything the Pope says and does.
Yeah.
And they'll defend things that are probably indefensible. On the other hand, there's people making the argument Patrick Coffin is making that, well, if you believe in the papacy, you have to defend everything he says and does. And they're making the same argument. And in both cases, that's false. It's not what the Catholic Church teaches. The Pope is not infallible in everything he says and does. It's okay to think that a prudential decision was imprudent. It's okay to think that some non-dogmatic statement was imprudent or even false. Like, that is well within what the Church teaches.
But I want to go a little farther than that.
Yes.
You could have a really bad Pope who materially damages the prospects of Christianity and even turns whole sections of the planet against Christianity. But that doesn't mean he's not the legitimate Pope and that God doesn't have a reason for allowing that.
Exactly. There was a period in the Church's history that was called the pornocracy because of how pornographic the 9th century popes were. And they were gross. And I'm not sure that those popes ever were in heaven. And if they were, it speaks to a repentance or the incredible mercy of God. That it was
I'm going to go with number 2.
Yeah, the Secula Obscura, the dark age of the papacy, was really dark. Not like this dark age in the sense of lack of learning. I just mean like there was a period of real moral corruption in which you had a series of bad popes. Go back to the Renaissance.
They're like Roman emperors in a way.
Yeah, exactly.
They competed with Caligula for depravity.
I mean, and again, like we can say some of this stuff we only know through their enemies, and so it may be overinflated and all of that. But even if it wasn't,
too.
Not true. But even if it wasn't, they aren't making some statement on faith and morals in an infallible kind of way. So we can say that person is our spiritual father, and he's an imperfect, maybe even a bad father. Those 2 claims are not incompatible, and so Patrick's challenge that if you're a Catholic, if you're a Catholic who believes the Pope is the Pope, you have to defend everything he says and does, would be an impossible standard historically. To say, oh, you have to defend John the 22nd, denying that the saints enjoy the beatific vision. he denied that, and the homily was quickly corrected by the theologians of the University of Paris. Popes make mistakes. They sin. They commit errors from time to time. None of that contradicts what the church teaches about papal infallibility. All of that is well within the scope of what we believe as Catholics. And so trying to hold the papacy to this impossibly high standard, or trying to hold individual Catholics to the impossibly high standard of explain why Jesus permits a bad thing to happen, that's bad theology.
Yeah. And in either way, bad things are happening. If the church is so corrupt that a pope had to fake retire to bring out all the corruption, if that's the truth, I'm going to need Jesus to explain that to me too. Do you see what I'm saying? If I'm going to demand answers from Jesus, I'm going to need an answer for all of this.
Right. If you're going to say that Catholics who believe the Pope is the Pope have to explain every bad thing that happens under his watch, then Patrick's own side would seemingly have to explain all of that and why Jesus permitted a fake papal resignation, permitted the real Pope to lie about being the Pope.
Right.
Plus all of that bad stuff that still actually happened.
Yeah.
It's a matter of history at this point that Pope Francis said certain things and that people were scandalized by it and maybe even walked away from the faith. That's not something that goes away if you just say, well, he wasn't really the Pope. You still have to explain, well, why did Jesus let everyone think he was the Pope then? You aren't solving the problem of evil. You're compounding it by hypothesizing an elaborate conspiracy theory that's apparently motiveless.
Yeah, and you're taking an obviously saintly man and saying he's a liar and a deceiver.
And it does no service to Pope Benedict to say that he's lying about not being Pope.
Yeah, or even, in some Jesuitical way, maybe not lying. No, none of that is the case.
And also, it's insulting to everyone's intelligence to say he thought he resigned, but he didn't understand the papacy as well as I do. This is one of the greatest theologians in the church.
Yeah,
you think you're going to get him on some technicality on the difference between munus and ministera?
Yeah.
I mean, it's just...
All right, so before we close then, and I'm very grateful that you came and did this with us, and I do think this needs to be addressed. I think that the danger is a kind of continuing to scratch at the itch, of people's conscience, of people's misunderstanding and confusion and all that, so that those who really should be at peace about certain things cannot find any peace and are, put in a state of great anxiety or terror or something like that. But the truth is, Pope Francis is the legitimate and true Pope of the Catholic Church. He's, even if he won't say it himself, he's the vicar of Christ.
And he also has said it himself.
But he doesn't use the word vicar of Christ.
He has as recently as 2019.
Yeah, but he does.
It's not in a pontifical yearbook.
Yeah.
That's the
right. But he is the vicar of Christ.
He is.
Is he the best one ever? Is he the worst one ever? Leave it to your judgment. But he is the one who holds that office quite legitimately, and the Lord holds all of us in his hand. He can change that when he's ready to change it.
And let's just point out, you don't really need to decide who your favorite and least favorite pope is. In the same way that, when you hear the instruction, obey your father and mother, it doesn't say, rank your father and mother compared to all other fathers and mothers.
Right.
Maybe you give your dad a world's best dad mug.
Yeah.
Hopefully you don't give him a world's worst dad mug. But whether you think he's the best or worst dad, that doesn't change the commandment. So I hope people listening to this are finding their minds put to rest by two things. Number one, Jesus isn't trying to trick you. The successor of Peter is the one who's obviously the successor of Peter, and that's Pope Francis. Number two, our duty is to obey, and we don't have to adjudicate how well we think we could do the job compared to him, or see, I don't think he should have done that, or you don't have to do that. Don't worry about that. Jesus is very clear about the kind of mind your own business passages. Like in John 21, when St. Peter's asking about John, and Jesus says, what is that to you? Come follow me. There it is. You don't have to decide John's business. You need to follow Jesus.
And this is something I think we want to always attend to ourselves and encourage our fellow Catholics to attend to, which is there's nothing in the world that's stopping you from embracing the fullness of the gospel and living it. And that's what you're called to. And that I know saintly Catholics who I think actually, and genuinely saintly Catholics, who I think barely know who the Pope is. And like they just, that's not in there. They're not thinking about that. They're thinking about the people they're feeding at the food pantry this Saturday. They're thinking about, you know, what they're, who's assigned to clean the altar garments this week. And so that's not a bad way to be. I mean, most of the saints never really bothered much with who was the Pope at the time. They just went out and they were saints.
Yeah, I think that there is a major problem being too online and adjudicating every controversy, even the ones that don't need to be adjudicated. There was a great piece on Catholic culture recently, but it may have been by Phil Lawler. It may have been by Jeff Mears. I don't remember. But it made this argument, basically, that there are people who are spending a lot of time worrying, oh, what if the Pope or what if the bishop orders me to do something immoral? But the examples of that historically, including in the present pontificate, are so exceedingly rare that maybe the Pope says something that makes it seem like sin is okay, but he's not ordering you to sin. And so your duty is to obey Christ and follow Christ. It doesn't mean you don't have to disobey the Pope. Like this imaginary crisis of I need to choose between obedience to Christ or obedience to his vicar is an imaginary one, which is ironically way more spiritually dangerous in real life than the elaborate hypotheticals people are dreaming up. I had a woman in adoration harangue me about whether the Pope was going to like order priests to do gay marriages. It's an unhinged conspiracy theory that never happened and never will happen. That like those kind of things, the lack of obedience and the lack of charity coming out of a totally implausible hypothetical scenario are doing real spiritual damage today to try to protect against an imaginary threat tomorrow. That's not of God. Like, you sin now because you might be forced to choose obedience or schism later. You know, like, don't. Like, just don't fall for that trap is what I would encourage people to do. Like, if you're anxious, if you're worried about tomorrow, spend less time online, spend more time in prayer, and live more in today rather than fretting about the past or the future.
Thanks, Joe. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
It feels so sensitive to have this conversation given who Patrick Coffin is and what he has meant to this apostolate, what he's meant to so many people. But I think it's okay to disagree every now and then. I hope we disagreed in a respectful way. I hope you agree, and I hope you found all of this interesting. We're very grateful to Joe Heschmeyer for sitting down and having this conversation with us. If you find this kind of conversation interesting and you'd like to have more of it, please subscribe. We do this every week. There'll be another episode later this week, as a matter of fact. We'd love it if you would subscribe, whether you're listening on Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, or one of the other services, or if you're watching us on YouTube, where we're really trying to grow this channel. If you'd like to give us some comments, we'd love to hear your feedback. Just throw them down in the comments or send us an email at our email is focus@catholic.com, focus@catholic.com. And don't forget, if you do like this material, if you hit the like button, that helps us grow as well. I think we'll leave it right there. I'm Cy Kellett, your host. Thanks for being with us. We'll see you next time, God willing, right here on Catholic Answers Focus.